Good afternoon. We're running a bit late, and I know that some people might have to leave early. My name is Tomer Brody. I'm the academic director of the Minerva Center for Human Rights. I can start off by saying that we work in an environment where we know there are things that are not under our control. One of them, unfortunately, is the heating. So if it gets too hot or too cold, because we have the windows open at the moment for recalibration of the temperature, then please let one of our staff know. Ambassador Geoffrey, Rector Medina, and distinguished guests from abroad and from the Israeli government and civil society, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to open the symposium on designing effective national human rights institutions as the culmination of a 3-year project at the Minerva Center for Human Rights here at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, under the auspices of the EU delegation and the European Instrument for Human Rights and Democracy, and with a multitude of cooperating parties. Just a few words in opening on the topic, National Human Rights Institutions, or NHRIs, which is an acronym that you'll be hearing a lot this afternoon. They can serve as an important bridge between government and civil society and a dynamic force in the protection and promotion of human rights at the domestic level. To do so, they must be recognized by the state, maintain their institutional and financial independence, and in their structures reflect the diversity of the society they serve. But these aren't enough. They must also leverage those elements set out primarily in the 1993 Paris Principles, which is another term that you'll be hearing a lot this afternoon, towards social legitimacy and effectiveness. Indeed, our concern today on the backdrop of continued backlash against human rights, and as we consider the potential for an NHRI in Israel, is on both legitimacy and effectiveness, as well as on the formal requirements for a proper NHRI. An NHRI for Israel is an idea whose time has come. In fact, it has been a long time coming, and I'm especially delighted to see Professor David Kretschmer and Rachel Benziman here in the room today. They were responsible for this first study on NHRIs in Israel, or an NHRI for Israel, almost 20 years ago, also at the Minerva Center. Conditions for such an initiative were not optimal then. Today they are no better, to say the least, but an effective NHRI is also no less necessary. Now, I'll shortly give the floor to Ambassador Geoffrey and to Barak. But before that, I'd like to thank the many people who have assisted us in this project in its various aspects, and I'll be describing the broader context of the project after the greetings. First, of course, the staff of the Minerva Center for Human Rights, Danny Evron, the executive director, Anat Mishali, the executive assistant of the center, Natan Milikovsky, who conducted most of the research and orchestrated the NHRI consultation process, Moana Vital, who isn't here today, but she directed all components of government civil society relations, Dani Levitan, who was in charge of the legal database part of the project, and Professor Yuval Shani, whose advice is always precious and has been involved in the project from its beginning. And moreover, thanks to the numerous government officials, in particular Dr. Roy Shundorf, who is not here today, but also Advocate Hila Tene-Gilad of the Ministry of Justice, Ronen Gilor, Sarah Weiss-Maudi, and Noam Capone of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as participants from the Office of the State Comptroller and Ombudsman and thematic commissions, who you'll be listening to later on, and a long list of participants from virtually the entire range of civil society organizations dealing with aspects of human rights. And in particular, I mean, it's a very long list, so we don't have all day, but we've been really sort of wall to wall been discussing with the civil society organizations. Is Debbie here? Yes, so at least that would acknowledge also the cooperation of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, especially Debbie Gilchayo, has also been involved with our project since the outset. And last but not least, our thanks to the EU delegation and to the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, and on a personal level to Estelle Kadouche, who is in charge, among other things, I imagine, also of the EIDHR at the delegation, and her predecessor, Sébastien Lorient, who unfortunately cannot be with us here today for personal reasons. He was in fact so inspired by the first stages of our project that he actually decided to abandon the EU Commission and to undertake doctoral studies at the Danish Institute for Human Rights researching NHRIs. So if we're talking about effectiveness, so here we have one example of unexpected effectiveness. And on that point, I think that's the perfect point to pass the floor to Ambassador Geoffroy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Boudre, Rector Medina, dear friends, colleagues from the Ministry of Justice, civil society, guests. It is a real pleasure to be here today for the opening of this event at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Sorry. Last year we celebrated the 7th anniversary of the State of Israel, but also the 7th anniversary of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. It was a very inspiring document that has continued inspiring the development of human rights across 70 years. And it's very relevant today as well. Nowadays, as a matter of fact, human rights are at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. As such, human rights are driven by the progress on the SDGs, as we call them, and the SDGs are driven by the advancement of all human rights. Human rights are no longer standing on their own. They are everywhere and have to drive our approach on every subject. And I think we have to remember this, particularly these days. And in this context, which makes our reflection on national human rights institutions all the more relevant, it's well recognized that no one model will fit all countries' situations, and no human rights national institutions will be the same in every country. So the opportunity to set up a national human rights institutions and the definition of its characteristics to fit domestic, legal, and cultural settings are both extremely and complex questions. And it's no coincidence that we're standing at the Hebrew University today to be able to gather relevant actors from the institutions, from the state institutions, from the academia, and from civil society to discuss such questions in a political environment which is not easy, which requires specific expertise, this discussion, and specific experience that others can bring. So I wish to congratulate the Minerva Institute for having been able to create the space where everyone can gather and freely discuss and engage on this topic. Through the 3-year project supported by the EU, the Minerva Center has supported Israeli civil society organizations in improving and institutionalizing the engagement with the monitoring process of the UN treaty monitoring bodies. The resulting increased dialogue between Israeli institutions and CSOs is extremely important to enhance the impact of civil society organization shadow reports and to foster the domestic follow-up and implementation processes of selected UN bodies' recommendations. And the participation of all relevant stakeholders to the various discussions that took place during this 3-year process is commendable, is remarkable, and was instrumental to the achievement of the project. So I'd like to congratulate everyone here at the Minerva Institute, in the various state institutions, and in civil society organizations that participated in this process for their commitment throughout the 3 years discussions. The presentation that will be given today is the first part of the event reflecting the close ties and the ever-growing cooperation between Israel and the European Union. We can offer to Israel a comparative analysis of what the European models are without the pretense that European models must necessarily satisfy the requests, demands, and the needs of Israel. They're just examples. They're based on concrete achievement, and I think they'll be helpful to better understand the challenges and added values of the various models. So I'd like to conclude to thank everyone for the presence today, but first and foremost I'd like to extend my appreciation to all the individuals representing Israeli official institutions, academic institutions, and civil society organizations who participate in those discussions. Again, I would like to say that your personal commitment and the fact that the Minerva Institute managed to create the right space and the right conditions for this engagement is the most significant and tangible result of your activity. Congratulations. Thank you very much.
Hello, dear Ambassador, my colleagues. Welcome to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us to discuss this important aspect of establishing national human rights institution. I would like to start by expressing our gratitude to the delegation of the European Union, not only for its financial support for this project, but mostly for its moral support and engagement in ensuring that our democracy is continues to be a liberal one and committed to liberal values, which is far from being self-evident, unfortunately. And of course, I would like to thank my friends at the Minerva Center for Human Rights for their fabulous activity, both academically and outside of our ivory tower in promoting, studying the issue of human rights and promoting human rights more generally. And thank you all of you who are involved in the project and coming here to this discussion. I would like to say just a few words about the nature of human rights, national human rights institution, from my perspective as a human rights law scholar, at least when I'm not rector. And it seems to me that there is an important question there, again, from my perspective as lawyer, about what should be the role of such institution, given that we have judicial review, we have the judiciary, we have other institutions, and what is the interaction or the social role that we expect such an institution to play. And it seems to me that in general, when we talk about human rights, we essentially talk about the translation of the government's moral duty into more specific rules. It's actually about rulifying morality, juridifying morality, and the question is, in what way is this way of rulifying the general moral duty to act right is expected to achieve social benefits? It is clearly the case that human rights, the concept of human rights, is aimed at the goal of making sure that the government acts right. The government acts according to moral standards, but the question is, in what way the whole concept of human rights is expected to help us to achieve this aim. And it seems to me that, as a general matter, we think about three main paths through which the rulifying of morality through human rights is expected to achieve this aim. And I would like to briefly state these three paths just to think about them both from the legal perspective, from the more standard way of judicial review, and just to kickstart the discussion about NHRI. Of course, one path of through which rulifying morality is expected to achieve something is simply to, as I said, to translate morality into more concrete rules in order to remove ambiguity, in order to make sure that we are less inclined to make mistakes when we employ moral considerations as such. The second path through which human rights may achieve this aim of requiring the government to act right is, of course, the whole path of judicial review and the status of law as such as a social construction that increases the likelihood that government acts right. But to my view, the main path through which the concept of human rights may achieve the aim of increasing the likelihood that the government acts right, and I think that this is the path that is relevant for our discussion, is the more social one. Human rights are central in developing a common culture of a duty to respect human rights by serving as a platform for public deliberation. You know, the language of human rights, the whole notion of the formation of social conventions as to the type of protected activities is essential for establishing an effective check on government. And it is in this respect that relying exclusively on judicial review to protect human rights, to ensure that governments act right, I think is lacking, is something that should be developed and added through the establishment of such institution. I think that the role of a national human rights institution should primarily be in complementing the activity of the judiciary, which lacks in this context of establishing this kind of a common culture of a duty to respect human rights through these other activities, both by developing what human rights mean, through enhancing public deliberation in this context, and many other means. And therefore, I think that even in societies that benefit from strong and effective judicial review, there is an important role for establishing this kind of an institution. And those who oppose to the establishing of this institution, I think, act from the perspective of the fear of that this institution will indeed enhance the development of such a common culture of a duty to respect human rights. So I hope that we will be able to be effective and contribute our to the establishment of this kind of institution, to enhance existing institutions that we already have in Israel that act in this direction. And of course, I wish us all very interesting and fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. The way we've designed the program is that the real action will be in the first in the later two sessions, which are the bulk of the program. But this event is also essentially the swan song of our second round of funding from the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, and it's an opportunity also to describe what we've done over the last 3 years, to provide also some more accessibility and awareness to the kind of work that we do, because the component relating to the NHRI is only one of several components in that project. And the project, from its origins about 6 years ago, stemmed for our identification of two significant gaps in human rights practice in Israel. The first is the dearth or the lack of internalization of international human rights law, despite the adoption of quite a number or most of the international human rights treaties. Most of the international law that you find in domestic courts in areas that relate to human rights, then their refugee law under the Refugee Convention, and of course international humanitarian law under the Geneva Conventions, and so on. But the human rights treaties have not received the same amount of application and implementation, of course not, because there essentially is no real implementing legislation for most of the norms in the treaties. The second gap is the disconnect between government and civil society, which at the time we thought is uniquely Israeli, but it's actually over the years then we've learned to see how it's also this gap between civil society and government has developed across the globe, around the globe, and also in Europe. And I'm talking about a lack of constructive communication, often confined to adversary relations, meeting in court or meeting perhaps in Geneva in the international setting of the treaty monitoring bodies. And we wanted to launch a project that, with a package of several elements, would address these gaps. Of course, we can't solve all of the problems. We're only academics, but we designed a package that we thought would leverage our strength as an academic research center in this coherent package of activities. So first, and this goes back to the first round of funding, and it's something that we hope to continue in one way or another, we developed and established a model for government, civil society, academia consultations in all areas of human rights concerns, essentially using the treaty monitoring reporting process, the reporting cycle, as a platform for debate, bringing the human rights debate back from Geneva to Jerusalem, so to speak. At first, our initiative was met with some skepticism, understandable skepticism, both from government and civil society, but surprisingly quickly this was overcome, and I think it's now quite well established that this so-called Minerva process of consultation provides a safe intellectual space for serious deliberation on otherwise sensitive human rights issues on a professional basis and in a civil manner. This is in fact something that in some states national human rights institutions do. So as academics we can actually fill some of the gaps in the absence of an NHRI. And this process facilitates the sharing of information, the airing of mutual and often conflicting concerns, all under the auspices of an independent academic research-based institution. For example, and we've had many events such as these, but I think it was about a year ago, we hosted a real wall-to-wall consultation on Israel's first report to the Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities, with dozens of participants from all disability-related organizations, including grassroots, who also submitted through our good offices a very detailed response to the draft report prepared by, in other words, they were exposed to the report before it was submitted in the form of a draft and could comment on it. And I think our model of consultation took a further step in preparation for Israel's universal periodic review at the Human Rights Council, when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs encouraged similar consultations on a broad range of issues at other academic institutions. So we see some diffusion of the model. In the context of that element of the program, and the ambassador already mentioned our involvement with supporting the preparation and submission of shadow reports or alternative reports that I think now sometimes they're even called supplementary or complementary reports. That's just a question of terminology. We had prepared a guide for civil society and good practices in preparation of such reports. And we also support our International Human Rights Law Clinic, which provides some services in preparation of shadow reports to civil society organizations that simply don't have that capacity. Second, as the topic of today's symposium, we prepared a detailed report. This is mainly Natan's work on the alternatives and or on the alternatives for an Israeli National Human Rights institution based on comparative and domestic research, and importantly, extending that model of consultation also based on research, not just in research, but on dialogue with and between government and civil society practitioners. The report hasn't been published yet. It's been distributed to the Israeli participants as a draft, and the foreign participants have seen an article which is essentially, at its core, it's a translation of the draft report. It will be published shortly as a report, and hopefully also in the future as a journal article. So it will, it won't be consigned to the dustbin of history as somewhere on the internet. The third element of our project is the establishment of a novel, detailed database annotating and correlating the treaties and treaty monitoring bodies' general comments and concluding observations to existing Israeli legislation and jurisprudence. So it's on a wiki platform. Hasn't been launched yet, so you're the first to see this. Essentially, and I think, well, it is in Hebrew, the idea being to make international human rights law more accessible to Israeli practitioners and civil society, law firms, and government. It essentially is a annotated index, a topical thematic index. So what I think Nathan just clicked through was equality as as an umbrella topic, and then that's being indexed into different issues relating to equality. And then if you're an Israeli lawyer and you know Israeli human rights law, but you are not aware of the international toolbox, then you can approach this this resource. And then Nathan, can you click on someone Tirgum Le'Ivrit, because the general comments of the treaty monitoring bodies in principle are not in principle, but they're simply not translated into Hebrew. They are available in Arabic as an official language of the UN. So we essentially outsourced professional translation of general comments to make them accessible to those for which language is sometimes a barrier. They're not official translations, they're on our own responsibility. So at a certain point we even had the UN logo on them because the interpreters really liked that kind of presentation, but we decided that for various reasons we can't take that in our responsibility. Both elements of this, in other words, both the translation and the annotation, and then they involved student work. So again, thinking about effectiveness, then we've been involving students in their first professional steps in this kind of awareness to international human rights law. Thank you, Nat. And it also includes European Court of Human Rights and some comparative aspects as well. Fifth and finally, we acted to familiarize Israeli civil society and government practitioners with the UN thematic special rapporteurs framework and the potential that cooperation with relevant rapporteurs may offer for the enhancements of human rights in Israel. We've hosted quite a number of current and former special rapporteurs in Jerusalem during the course of the project, and what we labeled as non-country visits. In other words, they're not in their official capacity as a special rapporteur, but nevertheless meeting with government officials informally and with civil society to explain what their work actually is, covering a range of issues from the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression to the right to privacy to the human rights implications of the disposal of hazardous wastes to indigenous rights. Now to focus on the NHRI component, just for a few minutes, and then this really sets the stage for the rest of the discussion. So the starting point in discussing an NHR in Israel is that formally there is none. And this is in contrast to over 75 countries in the world. Israel does not have what is known as an A-accredited or an A-level NHRI, in other words, one that could be accredited as satisfying the 1993 Paris Principles, and we'll be hearing a lot about that, I think, now, and the relationship between effectiveness and the formal sides of an NHR and so on. Having said that, and I think Barak essentially alluded to that, Israel does have what is called a national system for the protection of human rights. In other words, there's a complex of actors that constitute a system that, whether it's effective or functioning or not, that's another question. But nevertheless, there is a national human rights system which includes government ministries and people who are tasked with the implementation of human rights issues, the courts, of course, and this is what Barak was mentioning before, Knesset committees, civil society, academia, and a set of government agencies that that deal with human rights issues explicitly, namely the Commission for the Equality in the Workplace, Commission for the Equality of People with Disabilities, the Authority for the Advancement of the Status of Women, and the State Controller and State Ombudsman. And the initial research component of our project set out, after consultation, to map this national human rights system. In other words, to see what is out there and what the gaps are. In other words, what is the delta between what a full-fledged National Human Rights Institute would be like and what actually exists. So generally speaking, if we think of conclusions, if we could merge the strengths of each of these existing institutions into one, we would actually have something like an NHRI that could perhaps be accredited as well. But both de jure and de facto, that isn't the situation. So the State Controller and Ombudsman in Israel, that's a single institution, or it's two branches of the same office. The state controller, the current state controller, is very explicit about seeing his role and the role of his institution as a human rights institution, or one that is minded to human rights in their regular work. It is very independent as an institution, perhaps more than most NHRIs on a comparative international basis, and also receives individual petitions, which is not a prerequisite for an NHRI, but it is certainly a possibility for NHRIs. But it doesn't have an explicit statutory mandate regarding human rights. It doesn't have a mechanism for achieving pluralism, which is also one of the Paris principles. It doesn't have the authority, or at least doesn't engage in pre-reviewing, pre-vetting legislation. Its task is to review the implementation of legislation. And there are no significant programs for human rights promotion as opposed to protection, which are also a very important part of NHRI work. The other thematic commissions do have explicit mandates, but they are limited to, let's say, again, equality in the workplace. So we're talking about a certain type of equality and the rights of people with disabilities. And although they display de facto strong elements of independence, they are nevertheless formally part of government ministries. And I expect this all to be discussed in more detail in the second part of this afternoon's program and the roundtable that Yuval Shani will be chairing. So hence our recommendations that I will present them briefly. The first best recommendation, which we still believe should be considered in earnest at any point in time, is the establishment of a new institution dedicated to the protection and promotion of human rights, not unlike the conclusions of the earlier report that I referred to earlier. Now, since such an initiative is, to say the least, highly contingent in political terms, we didn't discuss what model of NHRI would be the ideal type model, a commission, a human rights ombudsman. There are many, and the ambassador was referring to that as well. You know, there are many ways to pursue the domestic, or to bring human rights into the domestic spheres through an NHRI. More realistically, perhaps, our second best recommendation is to overcome those gaps that we identified between the formal and practical dimensions of the state controller and ombudsman on the one hand, and the Paris principles and the idea of effectiveness on the other. And this is not so different from the process of converting long-standing ombuds institutions into NHRIs, something that has been pursued in other countries, and have people here with a lot of experience, in both on the practical side of processes like that and on the academic side. But this would require, again, an explicit legal mandate, a mechanism for ensuring pluralism, through perhaps an advisory committee, enhanced promotion activities, and more. Importantly, many of these changes could be achieved organizationally within the office and of the state controller, not necessarily requiring legislative changes. Legislative changes, if successful, would of course have the advantage of being, well, not permanent, but at least more solid. In addition, we proposed a set of measures necessary to enhance the capacity of the thematic commissions. For example, perhaps transforming the Commission on Equality in the Workplace into a Commission on Equality, and therefore broadening its mandate, increasing the number of experts and lawyers in these commissions and their independence, and perhaps also with an emphasis on those who are well-versed in international human rights law. And finally, we propose the establishment of a Knesset committee or subcommittee on human rights to be chaired by an opposition member that would be seized of reviewing human rights issues on an ongoing basis. We acknowledge that these are all very tall orders, but it is a discussion that we must start, or in a historical perspective, to restart. And so as part of this discussion, we really are fortunate to have with us some of the leading international researchers on NHRIs. I think I'll stop here and we can get the discussion started. So if you please join me, take your places, and I will introduce. Okay, and we'll have lots of, we planned long sessions so that we can have enough time for discussion and to best benefit from the international views. In fact, I've mentioned this to a few people as I was preparing for today, and of course I was somehow involved in the planning of the program, but when I got to preparing my notes, then I was really excited at seeing the group of people that we've managed to gather here that, you know, as I said 4 months ago, I think I didn't know any of you, or I might have met Tom, I think, in Geneva once, and but through the good offices of Sébastien Lorient, who I mentioned earlier, then turns out that there's a network of NHRI geeks. I don't know if that's you could call that network something like that, including also very high-level research and empirical work and really cutting-edge stuff. Now that we have so many NHRIs, and there's a large N that can be studied. So I think maybe I'll introduce you all of you together, and then we'll take it from there. So Alan Miller is special envoy of currently special envoy of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, which is importantly, and it's not a governmental institution, but it is charged with it has the role of accrediting NHRIs. In other words, with an important review process of institutions that are interested in being accredited, which gives them special rights of participation in the Global Alliance. Alan has the distinctive experience of having been personally responsible for building a Paris Principles compliant NHRI, namely the chair of, as chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission from 2008, the founding one, I think, is that the founding chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission between 2008 and 2016. He also led the development of a regional network of NHRIs as the chair of the European Network of NHRIs, or ENNHRI, between 2011 and 2016. Israel actually is not, that's not our region for purposes of NHRIs. It's actually the Asia Pacific Forum, which is based in Sydney, right? I think it's so somehow we are in that region for NHRI purposes. And was also Secretary of GANRI between 2013 and 2016. Currently Special Envoy of GANRI, providing high-level representation, advocacy, and capacity building since 2016. Also a roster member of the UNDP Crisis Bureau, engaged in the establishment and capacity building of NHRIs in a diversity of contexts. So really, we have a lot to learn in that respect. You're also a practicing lawyer and a professor at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Okay. To Alan's left is Corina, or Cora Lakatos, who is a career development fellow in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Edinburgh. She has worked across disciplines in the fields of international relations, cultural studies, and European studies, investigating topics related to culture, human rights, global politics, and research methods. She holds 2 doctorates. The later one is in international relations from the London School of Economics, and the earlier one is in Germanic and European Studies from the University of California in Los Angeles. Prior to joining the University of Edinburgh, she held research and teaching positions at the University of California, Stockholm University, University of Illinois. She was editor-in-chief and associate editor of Millennium, the Journal of International Studies, and her first book, The Invisibility Complex, was published in 2008. Importantly, she's currently working on her second book, which investigates institutional design and effectiveness in the case of national human rights institutions in Europe. And this will be heavily quantitative-based analysis at the regional level, mixed methods complemented by interviews in 8 different European countries. And Cora today will be discussing institutional strength, which I imagine is part of the thesis of or the framework of the book. Dr. Tom Pegram is Associate Professor in Global Governance and Deputy Director of the Institute of Global Governance at the Department of Political Science at UCL, University College London, with a DPhil in Politics from Newfield College at the University of Oxford. and former research fellowships at NYU and Harvard law schools. Tom's research interests span global governance, human rights, international organizations, and the politics of domestic compliance with international law, with a particular expertise in the study of national human rights institutions. Maybe I'll just flag one publication with Katarina Linos, What Works in Human Rights Institutions, which was published in the American Journal of International Law in 2017, and also significant practical engagement with NHRI work. And last but not least, especially since she is here on Christmas, right? The Orthodox Christmas is today. It's the Hebrew University recognizes the other Christmas as a holiday, but we haven't gotten to the Orthodox Christmas yet. Meska Mgesa Techane is a human rights lawyer from Ethiopia with extensive experience working at the national and international levels. Her previously held positions include in Ethiopia, High Court judge, head of the School of Law, and Deputy Executive Director of the Institute for Human Rights in Africa. She's worked closely with the African Union and the United Nations human rights bodies, and is currently a UN Special Rapporteur mandate holder as Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women. She's a doctoral fellow at the Human Rights Center at the University of Padua, and an associate scholar at the Women's Human Rights Education Institute at the University of Toronto and at the Geneva Academy. So, with those introductions aside, I think airing them together, then you can see that really is an impressive group of experts here. Then we'll start with you, Alan.
Okay, shalom. Thank you very much for the introduction, Tomer. Can everybody hear me? You okay? Thanks. It's a great pleasure to join you all at a very significant event in Jerusalem. I think it's the first time that there's been a representative of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions invited to Jerusalem, and we are very, very happy to join you today. Corin and Tom and Mescom are the real academics. I am not pretending to be one. I'm a practitioner with some reflections about the practice of national human rights institutions globally, and that's what I'd like to share with you. I'm just being mic'd up, and if I could have a glass of water, that would be good as well.
You have some at that end.
Thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank Tomer and his colleagues at the Minerva Center. I think the work that they have been doing over the last period is absolutely invaluable. Bringing together state officials, civil society, academics, within the context of increasing awareness and practical understanding of human rights and how that can be progressed in Israel. I have been around long enough to know that if human rights is about anything, it's about building relationships and bringing people from different places into the one space and then setting off on their journey together to make sustainable progress for all and in the concrete conditions of the context in which you're all living and working in. So I really am very, very respectful of the work done by the Minerva Center. The funding by the EU is clearly also acknowledged and very welcome too. Perhaps I should just, by way of introduction, share a few words of explanation about who am I and what my background is, and I'd like to make whatever understandings I have available to you throughout today, and I'm meeting with some of you tomorrow and maybe Wednesday. And also to say a few words about GANRI, the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, because I'm conscious this is the first time that we have been in Israel. As Tomer said, and as I echoed, I'm a practitioner, so a lawyer by background, and then was elected by the Scottish Parliament to become the first chair of a newly established national human rights institution, and charged with the responsibility of making it Paris Principles compliant through how the Commission was developed and built, and that was accomplished within a short period of time. And then from that position, I was elected by peers in Europe. There are over 40 countries and national human rights institutions throughout Europe. Elected myself as chair, to really develop the effectiveness of a regional network of national human rights institutions throughout Europe, all of us operating in very different contexts, even though it's within a single continent. There's a lot of diversity in the context in which we're working and the sort of NHRIs that have been built and were being built in the different countries. And now as Special Envoy of GANRE, essentially my role is to bring the experience of NHRIs on the ground globally into and around the UN decision-making fora and make sure that that experience we have on the ground informs the decision-making within the UN in its various human rights processes. So we have speaking rights at the Human Rights Council, and we are very much involved in the human rights processes both in Geneva and in New York. GANRE itself, like the Paris Principles, celebrated its 25th anniversary last year, growing from literally a handful of NHRIs 25 years ago to now well over 100 countries having established NHRIs at the call of the United Nations. And almost 80 of them have been accredited as A status, fully compliant with the UN Paris Principles. So quite an exponential growth of independent human rights bodies in the majority of countries in the world. And I think that's a significant thing for Israel and the Israeli state to consider, because this growth, particularly in the last few years, has taken place in a climate that is not generally conducive towards the growth of human rights bodies and independent institutions. There is, as we know, and you can see it clearly in the UN system, a challenge to multilateralism and to human rights more generally. And there's various reasons for that, and they vary from one part of the world to another. But within this challenging time for human rights and for the multilateral system, the growth of national human rights institutions reflects, I think, certainly by a number of states that have established recently national human rights institutions, that establishing a Paris Principles compliant NHRI is actually an expression of national sovereignty of that country within a multilateralist system. I often speak to ambassadors or governments in various countries who are weighing up, should we go down the road of establishing an NHRI? What's the added value? What are the added problems or risks that it might pose for government in these countries? And very often the conversation will begin when they will complain to me. We're given a hard time about human rights. The UN gives us a hard time. Amnesty International gives us a hard time. Human Rights Watch gives us a hard time. And sort of inviting me to feel sorry for them. And so after I share some sympathy with them, I say, well, look, there's something you can do about this. If you think that international criticism of human rights in your country is unfair, not evidence-based, not objective, doesn't understand the complexities of the politics or the history or the traditions in your country, then if you think that's the case and you don't think it's fair, then there's a perfectly reasonable solution in front of you, and that is to establish an independent national human rights institution which at a stroke puts you potentially from the back foot onto the front foot, because you can say, we take human rights so seriously that we're actually establishing an independent body within our own country which does know how things are on the ground, which does make evidence-based findings on what needs to be done. It's ours, in a sense. We have actually created it. And therefore, this is something that should be recognized internationally. And it's something that should enable us to engage on a much more level footing with international community than has been the case. And I'm pleased to say that, by no means all of them, but quite a few of these significant states have seen that, have recognized that, and have established national human rights institutions in those very situations. Now, what is a national human rights institution? I'm not going to try and walk you through the Paris Principles and giving you, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. They are all available, the Paris Principles, on various websites. The Minerva Center has got a handle on it all, and they can be a local focal point for increasing information about the Paris Principles. But from a very practical experience of having built one, having led the development of a regional network and now representing them globally, I would say the key to understanding what is an NHRI is to see it as a bridge in two respects. Within the country, it is a bridge between civil society and the broader public and the state. So on the one hand, what we say to the state is, we are prepared and wish to help you, to give you advice as to how you should better meet your human rights obligations in a very practical, nuanced way, recognizing the challenges you think you face with that. On the other hand, at the same time, we are going to make you aware of the shortcomings and what you need to be doing, and a kind of roadmap from our point of view as to how you should make progress in implementing your human rights obligations. So it's a relationship I would sum up as being one of constructive accountability with both hands. We're helping you, but we're also being honest with you that this is where you need to go, and we will go with you if you want to go that way. And then with civil society, the relationship of an NHRI to civil society is, we're not actually another NGO, a member of civil society as such. An NHRI has been created by the state, but given a statutory basis of independence, unlike any civil society body. So it is a unique role. And so the relationship with civil society is one of cooperation to increase the level of awareness and practical understanding of human rights by civil society, which can increase their effectiveness. What the Minerva Center is in fact doing to some extent. But then also the NHRI learns from civil society, who have frankly more on the ground experience of the daily concerns of a human rights nature that people are experiencing in their everyday lives, whether it be in hospitals or care homes or workplaces or on the street or in communities. And so it's a very natural relationship between civil society and NHRIs. That's the domestic bridging role, you could say. The international dimension of the bridging role, and again, it's more than hinted at by the Minerva Center, is the monitoring and reporting of how the state is implementing those international human rights obligations that it has willingly accepted and signed up to. And referring back to one of the earlier presentations from, I think, the rector of Hebrew University, what's the point of an NHRI? The point of an NHRI, and the reason the UN promotes them so much, is that it's fine for member states to sign up to international treaties, and there's a great peer expectation and pressure that they do so, and they should do so. And Israel, of course, has done so. It's another thing altogether that is given practical implementation on an everyday basis. There is an implementation gap between signing documents in Geneva or New York and passing laws in Parliament to say that you're going to incorporate them, and their lack of implementation on the ground. And this is a situation in every country to varying degrees throughout the world. It's not an Israel-specific or exceptional issue. It's the norm to various degrees, this implementation gap, which is why the UN has developed the Universal Periodic Review, the treaty bodies to monitor the implementation, to hold member states to account. So an NHRI is seen as being part of bridging this implementation gap by having a body created by that state willingly, but independent, and able to independently monitor and report on the progress or lack of progress by the state in implementing its obligations. Can I now just spend a few minutes on the theme of the topic, the practical application and experience of the Paris Principles. Effectiveness is very much at the heart of the implementation of the Paris Principles. So, what are essentially that experience? That independence of the institution is the most critical point. All of the responsibilities that the Paris Principles bestows on an NHRI, which might be advising the state, public education, inquiries, monitoring and reporting, can be complaint handling. Experience has shown that these are implemented effectively when the NHRI is genuinely independent. And its independence is assessed in two regards. Its formal legal independence. Does it have a statutory basis? Is the appointment procedure appropriate and public? Does it provide security of tenure to those elected to the positions of NHRI leaders? Is there adequate resources, etc., etc.? But then also the practical or operational independence. Does it walk the talk? Does it actually do what it is supposed to do and exercise the powers that it's been given by the National Assembly effectively? And so that I often go to countries who are thinking about, should we set up an NHRI or not? And they look at the Paris Principles and really only see them as being, what do we have to do to satisfy formally, legally, the requirements of the Paris Principles? With a sort of approach that once we've done that, that's it, and we can say we've got a Paris Principles institution. There's more to it than that. That's only the beginning of the journey. And the accreditation system of GANRI is that to ensure the effectiveness of the work, the performance of the NHRI, it is periodically reviewed every 4 years to assess, is it actually walking the talk in terms of these criteria of the Paris Principles? And so, for example, we will look at, well, what does civil society say about this NHRI? Do they think that it's adequately performing its role, or is it not? We will look to see, how do they engage with the UN human rights system? Are they fully engaged, or are they not? In a given situation, are they saying and doing the sort of things you would expect, or not saying or not doing the things that you would expect of an NHRI? So it's very much effectiveness at the heart of setting up an NHRI, that it has the potential to be effective, it's independent, and then monitoring and reviewing periodically its actual effectiveness. And very often now we will downgrade an NHRI from A status to B status if we get credible reports from civil society that this body has been compromised by the state. It's not really independent. It didn't do this or say that. And so it's this ongoing journey that should be fully understood. Finally, in hearing what the Minerva Center have been saying about the realities of the options in Israel for taking steps towards establishing an NHRI, the clean-cut approach, the plan A, would be just pass founding legislation to establish a Paris Principles NHRI. That's the straightforward, that's the best way to go. Not without its challenges, but it's the best way. If, for whatever political reason, at any country that claims to be based on the rule of law and respect for human rights should be able to establish a Paris Principles NHRI. But if in particular prevailing political circumstances that's not possible, then to explore strengthening the national human rights framework in order that the road is prepared for establishing an independent NHRI. Here, would that mean strengthening the Comptroller and Ombuds Office? This is a recommendation that I myself have made in various other countries. It's not without its challenges. The promotion of human rights is not part of the culture, generally speaking, of an ombuds institution in and of itself. So strategically, operationally, culturally, that body really has to transform itself into both protecting human rights in individual cases and promoting it. Public education, revising draft legislation, engaging with the UN human rights system, etc. So it can be done, but you shouldn't underestimate the changes that would need to take place in order that that is done. Finally, as I say, this is the first time that GANRI has been invited here. I really do appreciate the work that's been created, this space itself. Whatever path is decided to go down in Israel, whether trying to establish founding legislation for an NHRI, we'd be happy to work to support that, to review it, to suggest ways in which it would be sufficient to be given accreditation as an A status. If that road is not taken and it is instead to strengthen some of the existing organizations and to bring them together, there is experience of that elsewhere which we're happy to share and constructively work with the government, civil society and the Minerva Center. That's a matter for discourse within Israel, and that further discourse and the role of the Minerva Center in facilitating that is absolutely invaluable. So it's up to you, and GANRI is on standby to provide you wherever support consistent with the Paris Principles and the establishment of an NHRI with them. So, good luck.
Sure, please.
Tomer, thank you very much for the invitation. Super exciting to be here at what is sort of the completion of the first stage of a really exciting project, hopefully the beginning of a second stage of that project as well. I am giving you here a taste of a study that is pretty data heavy, so that's why I chose the old-fashioned PowerPoint as a more or less pedagogical kind of style aid. The study was motivated, or sort of, motivated, I guess, by a question that I was trying to address that Tomer asked actually in Edinburgh back in September, and about some observations that we were making about NHRIs, and he said, what about NHRIs that aren't accredited? What about countries that don't have an NHRI? So then I said, oh, I've got some old data, I should go back and try to update and maybe put this in a somewhat presentable form. So this is the study that I'm going to talk about, just a brief roadmap. It is a new or relatively new topic of investigation. I'm looking at NHRI strength. It's relatively new. I've published on it, but it's something that sort of draws heavily on existing scholarship, and I'm lucky enough that Tom was also a friend, has published extensively on NHRIs, and I'm building on his work as well. The study is global in scope and captures thus broad patterns, which basically means that, like with any research design choices we make, there's a bit of a trade-off being global, that will be in scope, and being statistical data. There's some nuance there that an important detail that qualitative research would capture more appropriately. So keep that in mind as we're looking at things that are sort of general and global in scope. Having said that, though, I'm very happy to contribute, to receive feedback, but also contribute with insights based on interviews I've carried out as part of a different project and the later discussions. And then I'll have conclusions and implications, so it won't just be statistics. I'll actually try to reflect on that as well. That will hopefully be of interest to practitioners in the room as well as academics. So two main questions in the study that I'm trying to tackle. What explains NHRI strength at the global level? I'll be defining NHRI strength just a couple of slides later. And if once we understand, or what we've understood, what factors explain NHRI strength around the world, then the subsequent and sort of logical question that I get a lot at conferences is, does NHRI strength matter for human rights outcomes? Or does it make a difference that an institution is stronger or less strong when it comes to human rights records? And NHRI strength and effectiveness are basically the two kind of key words for the study. The reason I got interested in sort of setting it up this way is because a lot of incredibly interesting and very valuable insights have been made and contributed to the scholarship by existing work, existing literature, especially in international relations and law, that look at whether or not NHRIs are, whether they diffuse across countries and whether or not they're independent, effective, pluralist, et cetera. So it's kind of a yes or no, 1-0-1 kind of study. Very interesting. But they begged another question, at least for me. If once we know that an NHRI, for instance, is independent or pluralist, how independent are they actually, right? So can we measure those characteristics in terms of degrees? And do more independent and pluralist, stronger, for instance, NHIs make a difference? So it's just yet another way of kind of defining the scope. And the reason this is also important is because it's global in scope, looking at institutions, not only at institutions that are accredited, but going beyond that. The scholarship so far has looked mostly primarily at NHIs that hold accreditation. So I'm also including, it's 187 countries, including also countries that don't have NHIs at all. Good, so what is institutional strength? It is basically a set of formal and written rules embedded in institutional mandates and official documentation. So it's been years and years of me reading fun institutional reports in 150 some countries. So I don't know if you want to be me, but it was great to have the results at the end. I proposed to measure along 11 different indicators. Whoever's interested in the technical measurement dimensions, I'm happy to take questions later, but basically what I've done is I've coded and identified 11 different indicators and then ranked them, right, from weak, sort of stronger, medium strength, and then very strong. And I made up two main dimensions. This is made up, I'm sorry, not made them up. Made up of two main dimensions of institutional safeguards. We're talking about durability and enforcement. So institutional strength is about those two things. More specifically, institutional durability is made up of a set of institutional mandated safeguards that help the NHI to weather changes in domestic and international circumstances. So basically, what is written in the statutory law or the constitution or the mandates of NHIs that allow that NHI to survive if changes, as they always happen in regime, for instance, and levels of support from government or from in the international community change over time. Three main dimensions, 4 different indicators, things like legal embeddedness, so to what extent the institution is embedded in the country constitution or law, national law or some other type of document, or if at all. Inclusion of human rights in the mandate could be different degrees of that. There's protection and promotion powers as well, and I break that down in terms of research, education, or semi-judicial powers on the protection part. I'm happy to talk more about that later. What is institutional enforcement? So the second half of the second part of institutional strength and the definition, basically a set of institutional safeguards that ensure that NHIs can carry out their mandated duties. So it's not just about what the NHI can do, but also building in into the statutory or the sort of main documents that set up of an NHI, some sort of safeguards that allow the NHI to carry out its duties over time effectively. There are 3 main dimensions, 7 different indicators, things like autonomy from government, measuring in terms of decision-making, participation, decision-making, finances, reporting strategies, and also the predominant promotion and protection activities. So not only the ones that are recommended, but also the ones that the institution itself prioritizes. And also pluralism of representation, a measure of inclusion of NGO representation in decision-making at the institution. So these are the main 2 definitions that are kind of new in my study. And to give you a taster of what the data looks like in its kind of raw, grayish kind of form at this point. There's an even distribution in over 187 countries around the world between institutions, NHIs that are ranked strong, that are ranked as medium strength, as weak, and as completely non-existent. So perhaps it's good news let me see if this pointer works. Does the pointer work? No? Okay. All right, it does, sorry. It is good news that there are nearly 50 institutions that are ranked strong. In my ranking, according to the indicators that I've generated, the medium category actually has the most institutions, and close to 40 are actually weak in their design safeguards. And non-existent, so nearly 50 countries that are keeping Israel sort of company to some extent, although Israel does have an institution in my coding. And one last definition before I present you the findings. What is effectiveness is something that Tomer and Nathan have also written about in their paper they shared with us recently, is the impact that the NHRs may have on human rights records at the domestic level. I'm using a measure that's used quite a lot in human rights studies. It's the Signorelli and Richards Human Rights Index, and they measure, it's for 2013, I think it's the latest wave of data, and they look at physical integrity rights and civil and political rights. I won't bore you with theory, although some of you may actually enjoy it more. But just to give a bit of credibility to the measurements, well, I'm defining, the definitions I'm proposing in the measurement and the operationalization are drawing from institutional strength theory, diffusion theory, and effectiveness for human rights. Three hypotheses that I'll discuss the level of findings soon is basically I'm drawing from existing literature. Two hypotheses are trying to get at mechanisms of NHI strength, so trying to explain why we have some NHIs that are weaker and others that are stronger. And when we're looking at network level socialization, which is something that has been demonstrated or shown already to be taking place in terms of NHI diffusion across borders and also NHI design. UN plays an important role for NHI strength through GANRI. That's basically what I'm proposing, and I'm trying to test whether or not that's the case, to see if the statistical data supports it. There's also a coercion-based hypothesis, so more kind of less socialization, more sort of on the material sides of things. So global PTA agreements, so preferential trade agreements with hard human rights conditionality have been shown to actually have an impact on whether or not countries ratify human rights treaties. So I was wondering whether or not that's actually the case for human rights, national human rights institutions in terms of strength. And at the regional level, EU membership conditionality, so it's a regional instrument, has been shown to actually have an effect on NHI diffusion and strength. So one hypothesis on NHI effectiveness is sort of a two-pronged one. NHI strength matters for human rights outcomes measured as the two domains of rights, so civil and political rights and physical rights. And here's the data for some of you who are statistically inclined. If you're not, I'm going to my best to make this kind of painless. Basically, three models. You've got here as the main dependent variable NHI strength, the aggregated measure, right? I put together all 11 indicators. Then you've got the disaggregated durability and enforcement dimensions. And I have to say, when I learned that Alan is coming, I was invited here. I was very happy that the analysis generated this result. Is the fact that UN accreditation matters and is the strongest effect on NHI strength. So that basically means that overall, around the world, if you have NHI, if your NHI has accreditation, it is more likely to be stronger than other NHIs. It's as simple as that. There's some support, though marginal support, for a conditionality explanation on the basis of preferential trade agreements. So that is the case mostly on strength as an aggregated measure and enforcement. So it's a marginal measure. However, one that's also statistically significant is whether or not countries are signatories of human rights treaties. What that basically means is that if countries are more embedded in the human rights regime at the global level, they're also more likely to have stronger NHIs. Perhaps not surprising, especially not to practitioners, but it's an interesting, I think, finding to be able to confirm statistically. Not surprising, some of these findings are not, they're confirming existing scholarship findings and scholarships and conclusions of existing literature. This one in particular is not surprising probably to anybody really, is that, except for maybe being pretty small, is that democracies are actually performing marginally better at having stronger NHIs. I'm happy to discuss this more in detail if you want, but basically the conclusions that I'm drawing is that socialization and acculturation effects through GANRI do make a difference. So countries do learn from each other, institutions do learn from each other, communication, it matters, information sharing and knowledge sharing is consequential, is very important for NHI strength. Integration in global human rights regime through international human rights treaties also matters, possibly also linked to socialization effects, possibly also really what acculturation basically indicates is not complex learning, right? Sort of trying to mimic for the sake of sort of becoming part of a network, but not actually really strongly believing in the norms, the human rights norms that the network diffuses. I'm hoping that you know, you sort of, especially those of you who have ever tried to measure things, that you'll understand how difficult it is actually to measure something like socialization, so communication, information sharing. So it's quite hard to differentiate between socialization and acculturation in the data alone. So there's support for that, and then marginal support for indirect coercion, which is what I mentioned a little bit earlier, through preferential trade agreements. So not a whole lot of support for that. Second set of models, and try to help make sense of this. NHI strength, durability, and enforcement. Do they make a difference when it comes to human rights outcomes? Can you see? Sorry. Okay. And two dimensions of rights here, two domains of rights, physical integrity and civil and political rights. And models kind of remain the same with the exception of the main independent variable of interest. In this case, it's the aggregated measure, durability and enforcement, right? So sets of models that kind of broken down by the main independent variable of interest. The good news, overall good news, is that NHI strength actually does matter. So that basically means the stronger an NHI is, the more likely the country is to perform well in terms of human rights records and human rights outcomes. So the impact is positive. It's only statistically significant when it comes to civil and political rights. And here, durability has an impact on physical integrity rights. This is actually, as far as sort of the nerdy academic in me is concerned, is very good news, because it's something that previous studies haven't been able to demonstrate when they've looked at, and does it matter that a country has an NHI or it doesn't, right? When you, and what I can say is, if you're trying to actually to rank the strength of an institution, you get a more nuanced view of what's happening in civil and political rights, not only physical integrity rights, which are kind of easier in a way, arguably easier to monitor the violations of. Also, again, not surprising, and it is the strongest result here, that democracies are performing better in terms of human rights, respect for human rights, and you know, here these are some controls, and war as well has an impact. None of this is really surprising in terms of existing work. Here is something else that's kind of disaggregating the result from before as well. So it turns out that being a signatory of a strong, I shouldn't use the word strong, of an optional, basically, agreement related to the ICC and the CAT makes you more likely to respect human rights. I don't think any practitioner is surprised by that, but it's still coming out in this model as well. Good. What does this mean? Overall positive impact of NHI strength. Okay. Can we get that? Thank you, Nathan. Sorry. So overall positive effect on NHI strength on both domains of human rights, although statistically significant, as I've spoken already about, on durability and enforcement on civil rights and political rights primarily. And what does this all mean in terms of implications, right, and recommendations? Basically, on the basis of the findings of the study, accredited NHIs are overall stronger than non-accredited NHIs at the global level. Qualitatively, we've known this for a while. Now we have the sort of data to back this up otherwise as well. Thus, learning and information sharing are important for socialization and acculturation to new norms. Peer networks with strong membership conditionality matter for compliance, right? So linked basically to the first observation as well here. This holds true in Europe alone at the regional level when you look at membership conditionality for EU candidate states. Stronger NHIs do make a positive difference in terms of curbing human rights violations. Thus, and this is directly, I think, relevant, governments' choices regarding the strength of their NHIs designs are consequential for their country's human rights record. So decisions about what powers you grant an NHI are directly consequential. Now, I'm not claiming causation, but I can at the very least prove correlation does exist and a direct relationship does exist. So it helps to make allies at home and abroad, basically, kind of with a little bit of help from your friends type of approach, to seek domestic and network-based peer support, because most existing NHIs have already had to weather a lot of changes and a lot of difficulties and challenges around the world, so talking to your peers or to peers usually helps. And ends up resulting in stronger institutions, and accreditation does make a positive difference. For non-accredited NHRIs, basically make a case for the inclusion of human rights. One can make a case for the inclusion of human rights mandates in existing weaker, right, in terms of the study, bodies. Nathan, do you mind? Sorry, I don't really quite know. I don't want to mess it up. Sorry. So one could make a case for adding human rights mandate or component to the mandate of an existing institution, but, and this is an observation that I can support also with qualitative data, only if sufficient funds and staff are allocated to perform these additional duties, or else it becomes something that is usually just kind of not foregrounded and not paid enough attention. And institutional independence, in terms of budget, autonomy of staff, and any number of sort of things that also the Paris Principles highlight, is key to a well-functioning NHRI. So the very last kind of set of recommendations and thoughts based on these findings, whenever possible, having a dedicated human rights institution is ideal. Basically, that is the ideal, the sort of best case scenario. However, as the study shows, having weak safeguards for durability and enforcement will likely lead to an ineffective institution. So you're going to create, if one is to create an institution, that institution having the appropriate strength in terms of promotion and protection is the ideal case scenario. And if anybody's in doubt, what I'm hoping to sort of add to also as a conclusion on the basis of the study is that there is evidence that NHRIs do make a difference in terms of improved human rights records at the global level as well. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. It's really good to be with you all here today. Thank you to Tome. Thank you to the Minerva Centre for this invitation. It is perhaps a relief to be an academic with a license to deal in tall orders, so that's what I'm going to do. My remarks are based on over a decade of fieldwork, of talking with leading NHRI practitioners like Alan and many others in both democratic settings and in less democratic settings as well. I'm going to focus my remarks a lot on the role of promotional powers, and I'll explain why that might be the case. But perhaps a question to begin. To what extent can we engineer a high-performance NHRI? To what extent can we rely upon a general-purpose Paris Principles compliant model? Or should we also think about bolting on custom-building NHRIs on top of that baseline to reflect operational conditions? And the Paris Principles, as Alan has emphasized, are really a crucial baseline for both safeguarding independence of NHRIs, but also in terms of enabling effective action in the form of protection and promotion of human rights. But surveying NHRI experience, and again, echoing Alan here, it's important that we don't conflate formal design compliance with action on the part of the agent. So in other words, formal design compliance with the principles don't provide any indication of whether any individual or groups of individuals have actually benefited in any direct way from the work of the NHRI in question. So in reality, what I observe is that the success of an NHRI does often wax and wane and then wax again, crucially based upon the caliber, the courage, and the competency of those individuals who lead the organization. So the extent to which good leadership can be engineered into organizational structure is, I think, a very important and a very interesting question, a difficult question. So beyond the formal baseline of Paris Principles compliance, another way of approaching this question is to ask, well, what is the goal we want an NHRI to achieve? And to work back from the goal. So what should the goal of an NHRI be? NHRIs have always had a crucial role to play in holding government to account, and that includes democratic governments, who also often don't like being criticized. But the question takes on, I think, additional urgency in light of what we observe out there in terms of the erosion of social conventions and important social conventions that are contrary to human rights. So we see that erosion taking place rapidly across political regimes, including in democracies. So in line with the spirit of the Paris Principles, one question to pose to NHRI architects would be, how can NHRI best be designed to protect those most vulnerable to human rights violations within a given territory or community? And to ensure that I'm succinct in my remarks today, I'm going to focus my attention on the importance of promotional powers. Now, promotional powers, and I might add that I'm not a lawyer, I'm a political scientist. Promotional powers are sometimes less well understood by lawyers and indeed government officials as a very important part of an NHRI's toolkit, especially when promotional powers are linked to protection activities. And I'm going to end by briefly also reflecting on the importance of alliance building and also on good leadership. So, as a preface to that, a few brief nitty-gritty data points on independence and protection safeguards. Our research suggests that transparency and meritocracy in appointment procedures is crucial to NHRI independence, that firewalling of an NHRI from executive influence to the extent possible is important, including no executive appointees to decision-making roles within an NHRI structure. And in terms of protection powers, formal protection powers, we found in our research that complaint handling powers are very important, even if they're considered optional by the Paris Principles. Complaint handling powers provide an NHRI with a direct interface with the citizenry or with the inhabitants within a country's territory, and they also provide a basis for scaling up individual claims into collective action claims. So in that sense, they offer a source of both authority and a source of legitimacy. And I would point you to the recent article Tom mentioned if you're interested in exploring some of those dynamics in more detail. So to turn to promotional powers, now given NHRIs generally lack enforcement powers, they can't issue binding decisions, it's perhaps surprising that not more attention is given to promotion as an important amplifier for protection activities. And what we find in our research is that promotional powers can serve as a structural enabler. They can allow an NHRI to punch above its weight, including under very difficult circumstances. So I've done research in the Philippines, in Malaysia and elsewhere, and as one former Philippine commissioner put it to me, promotional powers, in this case media impact, allowed the commission, allowed, in their words, this toothless tiger to roar. And indeed the Filipino NHRI is an impressive office and remains so to this day, operating under extremely difficult conditions. What are promotional powers? Well, promotional powers are socialization within state structures, so training of state officials, training of security personnel. They also include advising on legislation, even proposing legislation. All of those are very important activities for an NHRI, and indeed are recognized under other international instruments such as the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 18, Article 33, on national mechanisms. These are key functions of those national mechanisms under international human rights law. But also, and perhaps most importantly, promotional powers also serve to reinforce rights in the public discourse. As Professor Medina said, the role of NHRIs in terms of contributing to a human rights culture through education initiatives, through media interventions, and other similar activities. So promotion at root is involved in public dissemination of information, verifiable, credible information on the human rights situation within a given country. It's based on data, it's based on evidence. It's also based on active monitoring, verification of state practice. And it's great to have Mescarim here, and we'll hear more about inquiry powers shortly, which I also think are one of the most potent instruments that an NHRI has at its disposal. And this isn't promotion in the sense of, producing glossy brochures. This is perhaps the most effective form of human rights promotion, which is investigation and exposure of human rights violations in public. Now, that said, of course, NHRIs can't do this work on their own. And a recurring theme in my research is frustration over a lack of implementation. Most politicians are weather vanes. They react to the electorate. They don't make the political weather, if you will. And while there is a lot of focus on strategic litigation, an important focus on strategic litigation and judicial review, there's no particular reason to assume that the courts will always be a progressive ally when it comes to human rights claims. So a key challenge for NHRIs then is to build popular support for their own work, for a rights agenda out there in the community. And that raises an important question for designers as well. How do we best enable an NHRI to build coalitions? What are the implications of that question for design? And of course, this also has to be balanced with consideration of how you ensure, if we're going to say engineer plurality into an NHRI structure, as the Paris Principles direct designers to do, we also want to be cognizant of the challenges sometimes of ensuring cohesion within an NHRI organization, among the team, and also managing diverse internal subcultures, which is perhaps getting a little bit more into the practice of running an NHRI, but nevertheless, I think it is an important consideration. And it also means giving NHRI autonomy to liaise as it sees fit with local and international actors, to receive, to channel, to disperse resources to local third-party actors who may be better placed to pursue certain human rights goals and objectives where those goals align. So, I've covered a lot of ground in a very short space of time. I would direct you to my article, which is a 30,000 words, it's a proper bedtime reading number, very long piece, and it goes into great detail on some of these dynamics. But just in closing, I would like to emphasize that effective NHRIs are not weather vanes. They don't always seek to harmonize interests. They must also be signposts, they must lead, and sometimes they have to be prepared to enter into conflict. Witness, for example, the very brave defence by the Australian Human Rights Commissioner a year or two ago of refugee children held in indefinite detention offshore in the face of sustained attacks by the Australian Prime Minister and the Australian Attorney General. And as Philip Alston has reminded us, human rights has never been a consensus project. It has almost always been the product of struggle. And promotional powers, I think, highlight the importance of principled public action by NHRIs, which do have a particular authority and a particular status in society that needs to be protected and nurtured. So to close, I would just raise some very difficult questions. How can leadership integrity be assured through design? How can NHRIs best be designed to broaden outreach? How can they best translate the shared pragmatic concerns of the general public into human rights language? I think these are key tasks that face NHRIs, and of course I think the current political climate makes those tasks both more urgent and more difficult. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
The earlier presentations made it very easy for me to start with. Already the unique position, the crucial role of national human rights institutions have been already asserted, and I'll just start from there. I don't want to dwell much on that, but just my topic is on what role a national human rights institution can play in addressing systemic human rights violations. So it's different from Tom. I'm focusing on the protective mandate. Maybe, as he said, lawyers like adjudication, protection, litigation, but not for that, because the national human rights institutions have unique techniques and tools to arguably to address systemic and widespread human rights violations, and in particular I would like to focus on their inquiry power or investigative power. So I will start with just general discussion on NHRI's role in this context, and I will move on to a closer look at national inquiry power. What would that offer in relation to addressing or redressing widespread human rights violation? And I will also bring some closer look at some, national inquiry experiences from different countries. Uniquely positioned between government, civil society, in the international human rights system, we can argue that national human rights institutions play a very distinct and crucial role in addressing and redressing systemic human rights violation. It's actually asserted that their role becomes more important in relation to such complex, widespread, and gross human rights violations. NHRI literatures actually establish that NHRIs should be regarded as structures as well as agents, which would bring a very key role or mandate for them to deal with systemic human rights violations. This twofold nature or dual role as agents and structures would bring a lot in terms of dealing with complex nature of human rights violations. The comparative advantage for human rights institutions than courts would be they have a proactive mandate than reactive, unlike courts. As we know, the inherent limitation of the judicial process or the court process is a source of discontent when it comes to human rights enforcement, for the very reason that courts are always limited to active litigation to intervene. And the other would be also the need for non-judicial approach, utilizing a broader set of tools for addressing some cases of human rights violations, which NHRIs are arguably believed to have those unique techniques and tools that are not necessarily judicial or legal. They have the liberty to introduce a broad range of tools to address human rights implementation. It's for the very reason that some human rights violations or some human rights contexts, they demand non-conventional human rights implementation beyond a complaint-based model, beyond the court process, and beyond the conventional legal or judicial techniques. In this context, then some violations demand structural enforcement or structural remedies that are very imperative for addressing the complex and systemic nature of the violation. And my argument, and as also some other scholars argued, is that such structural enforcement are national human rights institutions are well suited to offer, at least to catalyze such structural enforcements or structural remedies, which involve broader orders, broader recommendations that require institutional reform, that require bureaucratic reform over a long period of time, and that also address the demands of the lower income groups or the lower sectors of the society. So given the advantageous position of NHRIs, that is different from courts and also different from other human rights actors, NHRI's investigation mandate can be used innovatively and effectively to bring such structural remedies, as I would also later on I would also bring some of the experiences in the different countries. Looking at, so as I said, I'm focusing on the national inquiry power, and then national inquiries, just to give a brief description, are non-judicial, often large-scale investigations or hearings into widespread systemic human rights abuses through which NHRIs document violations and recommend remedying measures for human rights compliance. Inquiries mostly deal with a large number of individuals and are normally easily accessible as compared to other adjudicative process and flexible in nature. Inquiries are much more than conducting a study or a research, which an NHRI can also do, but they are different because they involve a very thorough investigation and publishing a report with critical findings and policy recommendations. And they have different methodological approach and process design. That's why they should be innovatively and effectively used by NHRIs. Actually, scholars made persuasive argument that national inquiries can be one of the best ways for an NHRI to translate its sometimes limited mandate into effective contribution to domestic human rights change. How to go about an inquiry is always at the discretion of an NHRI, and it depends on the subject matter in focus, and certainly it's different depending on the nature of the violation or the scope of the violation. But notwithstanding this different scope, this different approach, any inquiry is expected to involve data collection, stakeholder engagement, public outreach, and presentation of findings to the relevant government authorities and also the public. So an inquiry procedure is an important means by which NHRIs can play their fundamental role in the protection of human rights. As part of this monitoring function, they have the power to examine state compliance with human rights standards, both at the legislative and policy level, as well as practice. Inquiries enable NHRIs to respond to both evidence of systematic human rights violations, as well as set standards for change. Actually, I will quote a researcher who highlighted the very important nature of the findings. Unlike other annual reports or promotional reports or monitoring reports, an inquiry finding or an inquiry report will have 5 crucial functions. First, it documents evidence of human rights violations. Second, it provides a platform for the voices of the victims to be heard and their stories to be told. Thirdly, it is the mechanism through which NHRIs make recommendations for change and redress. And fourth, it is an educative tool informing the general public about the issues and the case for change. And fifth, it provides advocates with credible data to continue to lobby for change beyond the work of the NHRI. So the reports can be can bring multiple advantages beyond conducting an investigation and releasing a report. And it has proven, the methodology has proven to be valuable across all categories of rights, because some rights, especially economic and social rights, sometimes they require, they present a complex context for human rights enforcement, for human rights adjudication, and national inquiries actually have proven to be very valuable in terms of economic and social rights implementation. Other researchers, Corkery and Wilson, actually asserted among the most significant powers enjoyed by NHRIs is the formal power of inquiry into systematic human rights violations. This inquiry, often why it is powerful, is it often involves or it often comprises a strong judicial power in some jurisdictions. For example, in Kenya and India, the NHRI's inquiry power involves the power to subpoena, the power to compel any state authority to cooperate with the NHRIs to produce documents, to produce information. This is a very important power, unlike other actors, like civil society or international organizations who don't have this leverage. I will just, sometimes there are questions of legitimacy, whether NHRIs can do investigation or can have a very broad power of investigation. And in some jurisdictions, NHRIs have direct inquiry power or formal authority to inquire in their statutory base. For example, in Australia, India, Kenya, New Zealand, and South Africa, they have explicit inquiry power in their establishing proclamation. But without this, I argue, and others also support this argument, without this explicit mandate, even we have the Paris Principles that gives general inquiry power, which under this Section 3, for example, the Paris Principle clearly established that NHRIs must be free to consider any question falling within their competence, as well as to hear any person and to obtain any evidence relevant to human rights mandate. And this has been also supported by treaty bodies. For example, the Committee on Economic and Social Rights, in its general comment number 10, dealing with NHRI's mandate in the economic and social rights implementation, stated clearly that inquiries are very important power for NHRIs in advancing the implementation of economic and social rights. Inquiries are very distinct or advantageous for NHRI's investigative power. They are public, as I stated earlier, very dialogic, dynamic and reformist in nature. The inquiries being held in public and engaging a range of stakeholders and facilitating interactions between all affected and concerned groups makes them very powerful in orchestrating deliberation and dialogue among all stakeholders, from the affected community to civil society, government authorities, and non-state actors. Actually, again, quoting a researcher, at the center of national inquiries conducted by NHRIs are grievous human rights violations, with the specific aims of each inquiry will differ, while the specific aims of each inquiry will differ, and all national inquiries seek to create change, to stop systemic and widespread abuse, and to encourage internalization of human rights norms. As part of the process, NHRIs provide a platform for the voices of victims to be heard, gather evidence and stories, and to educate the community and facilitate dialogue with violators. So having this comparative advantage of national inquiries, being a very dialogic, open or public discussions and reformist in nature, I would like to just bring some experiences from national human rights institutions in the Asia Pacific and also in Africa. As Tomer earlier said, the NHRI here, for NHRI's purpose, belongs to the Asia Pacific. So maybe it would be interesting to look at some of the inquiries held by, maybe let me leave Africa and I will come back to that if there's time. For example, from Asia Pacific, the Filipino Human Rights Commission has done an inquiry, a national inquiry on sexual and reproductive health. Some of them were already passing by, and you might have seen the Filipino Human Rights Commission inquiry. In 2016, they investigated the implementation of the reproductive health bill to disclose widespread or systemic violation in the implementation of reproductive health rights in Philippines, in particular affecting young girls and women with a very limited access to family planning service and other sexual and reproductive health service. And it was a 15 days fact-finding that involved a number of hearings in all the regions, 15 regional consultations, and more than 1,000 participants were covered in the hearing. And it also included marginalized groups such as persons with disability, indigenous people, and others. And they covered all government departments that are concerned in the implementation of the rights. And the findings disclose the uniform implementation of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Bill and called for a policy reform and also strengthening the national the national policy on sexual and reproductive health. It also called for budgetary interventions for the proper application of the bill. In Nepal also there was an investigation on the right to water and food. It was actually triggered by a cholera epidemic that killed many people in the country. And the NHRI actually picked the issue from the media and started an investigation into the most affected district in the country. So it covered food stores, it covered authorities water sources, and it found out the pollution, water pollution and also food pollution. In the process, the Commission actually convened so many actors and NGOs, individual members of the society, international NGOs, experts working in the area of the right to water and food, and also organizations and individuals that are working on consumers' rights. This inquiry actually also brought the discussion on the right to water and food from the UN the Committee on Economic and Social Rights recommendation. So it also brought the discussion of international instruments or the domestication of international instruments into the domestic implementation of or understanding of the right to water and food. At the end of the inquiry, of course, the Commission was successful in disclosing the widespread and systemic problem in the country when it comes to the implementation of the right to water and food, and it also disclosed the marginalized and remote areas were affected very much due to lack of policy implementation. There are interesting examples from Australia and New Zealand, still in the Asia Pacific. In particular, maybe you might have already heard that in the discussion of national inquiries, the Australian Human Rights Commission is often referred or quoted because the Commission regards the national inquiry methodology as one of its most effective methodology to implement, to monitor human rights violations. One very famous case is the inquiry on mental health that was conducted in 2007 that took many years, actually, 3 years, and involved more than 1,000 witnesses and submissions, many open hearings, review of several documents, policy documents, legal documents, and also institutions were reviewed. And the interesting remedies were also achieved from this inquiry. Actually, the Commission is always proud that this inquiry has brought a national policy on mental illness for the first time as a result of the inquiry. So many standards were reviewed. The debate was also triggered in the country and it raised awareness on the rights of persons with disability, in particular in persons with mental illness. The same also, the New Zealand Commission dealt with persons with disability, but in a different context, in the transport system. The Commission in 2005 inquired how accessible the land transport was. And it brought a different perspective in also bringing private sector accountability, because it covered investigation of the transport provided by the private sector. And the same as the Australian inquiry also, it brought negotiated remedies between by convening discussion between violators and also the affected community. It also brought change in the transport model in New Zealand, basically bringing review of the policy, legal and institutional framework when it comes to accessible transport in the country. As you might have noted in the pictures, I don't have time to go through the content of the inquiries, but in Kenya, also South Africa, and Sierra Leone in Africa also, they have done very interesting inquiries in relation to business and human rights, in relation to also institutions in mental health sector. And also very interesting actually is they have done inquiry on public budget, how public budget is allocated and invested, which is very important for addressing systemic human rights violations. So in conclusion, inquiries offer a very unique tool to address human rights violations that are systemic, widespread, and complex in nature, because they allow the use of different broader tools that are not necessarily limited to the judicial process. And they also offer the NHRI to convene all important actors, from individuals to state authorities and non-state actors. And also they offer the instrumentalization of the international human rights law. So this is very important because in some jurisdictions, all the rights, for example, economic and social rights, are not part of the justiciable human rights framework, and then instrumentalization of the international human rights framework is very important in the uniform or the universal application of the standards when the domestic system fails. And most importantly, they are very deliberative process, and they bring deliberation of all actors into a negotiated remedy. Sometimes such structural remedies or negotiated remedies take a lot of time, and they are not necessarily achieved by judicial process. My last statement will be, for this to work, of course, there are requirements that need to be fulfilled. It goes without saying that independence is important, but beyond independence, or other internal factors such as resources, technical capacity, autonomy are very important for an NHRI to be effective in its inquiry power, and external factors such as the collaboration with the media, civil society, and other activist forces, both at the domestic and international level, are very important to make an inquiry very effective. And effective inquiries also contribute a lot to the effectiveness of an NHRI to deliver on its protective mandate. Thank you.
So we still have several. This has been a bit of a crash course in the state of the art with respect to NHRIs and effectiveness and institutional design. Lots of points of questions, but we'll have time to discuss them later. So, questions from the audience? You are.
So, as Tomer said in the introduction, we were involved in Minerva Center in a project of this nature 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, 18 or 17 years ago. 18, 19 years ago. That was 2000, 2001.
The submission was in 2000, I think.
During the time that Yossi Benin was...
And essentially, at that time, there was a Labour government. The report was commissioned by the Minister of Justice. So we had, we had many cards. And then, of course, like it happens, there were elections. I think that the minister received the report on his last day in office. And then there was political transition and the whole thing. And now, in a way, we are in a completely different situation where the Minister of Justice is not commissioning this report, let's put it this way, okay? And the question is, from your experience, your comparative experience, is there a right time and a wrong time for pushing for an NHRI? I mean, and this has been all, I think, in our discussions, this has been, we've been often concerned as to whether pushing too strongly for something too ambitious at this point in time will do more harm than good. And any insight you can provide us from a comparative perspective will be highly appreciated. And a related topic, which is to this, is the topic of independence, in the sense of we are, we have a lot of discourse about constitutional capture, that you are seeing institutions that are supposed to be independent, and we call them the gatekeepers, are being taken over by elements which use them for some other purposes. Now, I'm not talking necessarily about Israel. I mean, there are countries, in Europe in which this is happening and elsewhere, and there are concerns also about this in Israel. And again, the question is, in light of this pushback against gatekeepers, concerns about the existing infrastructure and its institutional welfare, whether throwing into the mix another system of protection, is it from a civil society point of view, is it going to do more harm than good? Sorry for the length of the question.
Be a little wider and never let go.
Thank you. I'm curious to hear Dr. Lakatos and Dr. Pegram's insights about a point that you both addressed from your different perspectives, your different empirical, analytical research. It was very encouraging to see that in general there is a correlation between the strength and effectiveness of the National Human Rights Institutes and the general state of affairs with respect to human rights, and it's intuitively just proves what we would have hoped to, or what we thought would be expected. And then Dr. Pegrams mentioned those exceptional cases, if I understood correctly, of specific countries. It comes to mind maybe the Philippine case, where there's a relatively very strong institute, yet we know that there is no correlation, at least in that country. So it's kind of a paradox. Obviously, national human rights are not the only factor with respect to the general state of affairs of human rights, but I would like to hear from your perspective and experience how you explain that. Not necessarily the fact that the general state of affairs is so bad, but in fact, how are the institute, how is it maintained? How does it still progress, if at all?
Hi, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the principle of pluralism and how maybe some various NHRIs ensure that principle within the institution, and also what it actually means. Is it thematic, the people participating, and how it's ensured going forward within the institution?
I'm following on for something that is what Ruth said. What we've seen, both in my mind as far as international treaty bodies goes, and to a certain extent as far as judicial institutions in our country goes, is the more successful they become in protecting human rights, the more interest politicians have in weakening those institutions and trying to appoint persons who will be less protective of human rights. Now, have you seen this in national human rights institutions, and how do you protect, if at all, against such developments?
Anymore? So I'll be very specific in a question to Cora. Maybe I've been doing too much quantitative work recently, so I actually connected to those. Okay, so I'll completely, the two questions on, you mentioned the effects of conflict, so if you could elaborate a little bit on that, and I'm asking this, of course, in the Israeli context. One thing that we left out of our report was the big question of territorial application, territorial jurisdiction of an NHRI in the Israeli-Palestinian context. And the second relates to, I didn't see in any of the comparators or variables the degree of participation in the treaty reporting process, because the treaty, it's actually a very low percentage of treaty signatories or treaty ratified treaty parties that go through the entire rigorous reporting process. So I'm wondering if there's a connection or a disconnect there. And I think maybe a last question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Alan Miller mentioned the significance of various factors that strengthen an HNRI, and one of them was the tenure of leaders elected. Now, I don't know how the leaders are elected. I'm interested in knowing leaders elected by who, and what would be the basis of why would tenure be encouraged.
Okay, so maybe we'll do just a reverse, because some of these questions were general. So from each of your own personal experience, we'll start with Mester.
Maybe I'll start from the question whether we have seen symbolic appointment.
Or people who are less protective of human rights being appointed. Yes, I will not name countries or NHRIs, but I have seen that a lot in some places. Some individuals or commissioners are appointed just for the country to prove that they have an NHRI, but which is not strong enough. They have an NHRI, they meet the international standard of having an NHRI, but then they don't want a strong NHRI, so that they will not be critically examined in their human rights performance. So how to protect the system from such people? I think some of the methodologies we have used in those countries would be civil society activism against such appointments. Civil society being very critical on the performance of NHRIs is very important, which goes to their public legitimacy. And the other is also the use of the UN mechanisms, also to say something about to pressure the government as to the independence of the institutions. And this, I think, relates to also the accreditation system itself. The accreditation system would have also its own impact on that. And on pluralism, maybe for me, pluralism, one is the diversity of commissioners or also the staff. Sometimes you would have all lawyers. Sometimes you would have mostly lawyers, actually. So pluralism is also about the multidisciplinarity and also the different categories of the society, from civil society, from the academia, from other groups. That's plurality in my understanding. And maybe also expertise, right? The expertise also, because the NHRI is expected to cover many, as broad possible, to have the broadest possible mandate on different rights. So the expertise should be different when it comes to the specialization on the rights that they have expertise on.
I'll respond briefly. You could write a mini essay on each of those questions. But yeah, is there a right or wrong time for pushing? The question of whether might be reformulated a bit as to whether it's always better to have an NHRI or not. That's a question that we did address directly in an edited volume that I co-edited with Ryan Goodman. That was published on NHRIs in 2012. And I think the general conclusion was generally yes, there are exceptions to that. Perhaps Fiji might offer some cause for reflection, and one or two other cases, but generally never underestimate the potential for unintended consequences, the civilizing force of hypocrisy, as John Elster would put it. You can look at Peru, you can look at Russia, various other cases where the NHRI was established under authoritarian conditions and nevertheless performed admirably. So an NHRI can then perform, its task in splendid isolation, potentially, but of course, if the gatekeepers are taken over, well, the virtuous cycle of accountability will not be completed. The judicial system probably will not be taking on cases, referrals from the NHRI and so on, at least not in a willing and able manner, and therefore the institution will be severely hamstrung. Now, that relates, of course, to the second question, which is how do we explain then NHRIs operating in very hostile settings? Well, they can serve as islands of functionality within a highly dysfunctional state system. It is a possibility. One way of doing that is to be very strategic and to not target core regime interests. And that's certainly what Peru did. The Peruvian ombudsman did under the Fujimori dictatorship in the 1990s. And you address important issues where you can, prisoners' rights and so on. They did get into some pretty thorny territory. But you also address issues that are going to have public support, such as, say, excessive utility tariffs and other issues that really upset people on a day-to-day basis. The Filipino case currently, I think, is a key exemplar of this situation. It is alone in a maelstrom. The former chief commissioner of the commission is currently in prison under very dubious drug trafficking charges. I think we explained that through a combination of bravery on the part of the leadership and also international support, a lot of international support. On plurality, again, a lot could be said on that, but I would just make the distinction, and Alan no doubt will be able to go into more detail, between the ombudsman model and the commission model. The commission model, plurality is absolutely integral to the structure. You have a range of commissioners within that body in an executive function. The ombudsman model, you have a unitary leadership structure, but nevertheless you can build plurality in through, the senior leadership team can be very plural even within an ombudsman structure, more common in Eastern Europe and in Latin America. How do you protect the gains made? Professor Kretzmer's question. Yes, it's extremely easy to destroy credibility. It's very easy to do that. It's very hard to build strong, credible NHRIs. And there are some very interesting cases that one could look at. I think Mexico, for example, is really experiencing a revival under very difficult circumstances under the current leadership after decades of low functionality. Why? Well, partly because heroic action, or at least credible action, by an NHRI does set expectations. And new leadership may feel compelled to meet those expectations. And in Peru, we see the people going to the streets to protest dubious political appointments to the office. So sometimes public mobilization has been effective in preventing dubious political appointees to these offices at later life cycles down the road. Finally, appointments. These are independent state-funded institutions. Often people say, well, how can they be independent if they are state institutions? But of course, one could raise the same question of courts. How can a judge be independent given it receives state funds? And we might draw some analogies and think about how we ensure the integrity of judicial appointees with how we ensure the integrity of NHRI appointees. Thanks.
I'm obviously just going to add just a couple of small points to Mascarenhas and Tom's answers, which were really eloquent. So what I can say is, at least based on my research in Europe, especially interviews, qualitative interviews, is that possibly the intervening variable that's the most important in making sure that strength and effectiveness are actually interlinked, and there's a direct and positive kind of relationship between the two of them, is the leadership in place at any time at an institution. So it could be that you have a country like Poland, for instance, where right now the situation, the support for NHRI really at the government level is actually missing, largely missing, and so the pressures even on the commissioner himself are actually quite significant. At the same time, the commission is actually doing a tremendous amount of really good work. Then again, they're also benefiting from a strong design, which was really an unintended consequences type of thing that was sort of done before really the fall of the Berlin Wall and all of this. It's a longer kind of contextual thing. So what I can say is the leadership in place at a certain time makes a huge difference. It overall, though, for an NHRI to function well in the long run, I think government support at the very least is needed. And then again, obviously, a good relationship with other institutions like the courts and all of this, and internationally too. Quickly on Thomas' questions, I'll possibly give you more detail later too, but the effects of conflict, civil war, at least based on what I've showed you right now, affects negatively the strength of the NHRIs. The global level, this is possibly not surprising, but I think the sort of how of it and why of it has to do with the fact that just by the establishment process, when NHRs are established at the time there's a conflict ongoing in the country, the processes themselves are just not really particularly transparent or effective as processes to set up an NHRI. Oftentimes, and this is, I'm sort of working on something.
That goes to your last question.
Exactly, it relates to exactly that question. And I'm actually working on a project now using the PAX database as well, looking at how sort of peace agreements and the role that NHRIs play in that. And actually, a lot of peace agreements overwhelmingly mention NHRIs as more so than regional or international human rights institutions as the sort of hope for implementation and monitoring of peacekeeping. So it's important.
Transitional justice.
Exactly, that context. Whether or not they're effective in doing that is a different story, and we can talk about that later as well. If it matters, interstate war doesn't seem to have, it's not correlated, let me put it this way, it's not causation there, so I won't back that up to no end. And then in terms of degree of participation in treaty reporting processes, as you know, not all NHRIs participate in that. However, I do, and I'll tell you more about the sort of technical details of it, I do capture some of that in the strength variable, one of them. So, well, yeah, I won't bore everybody with technical details, and we'll talk more about it later. Thank you very much.
Yes, I think Yuval's question goes to the heart of where we are in this discussion. I've only been here a few seconds in comparison with your time here, but that question resonates for me from the experience I have working across a range of countries. I would say the very brief answer to your question, yes, there are moments in a country's development which are more favourable than others for the creation of a Paris Principles compliant NHRI. However, I think for purposes of this discourse, what is critical is that whether or not that moment exists today, you don't take a passive approach and just sort of wait for a moment to arrive. You work actively towards either helping to create that moment to arrive or to take advantage and be ready to take advantage when that moment does arrive because of other factors beyond your influence. From my experience, I would say there are at least three issues that play into this question. In terms of preparing the conditions to take advantage of a moment or to create a moment, the public discourse is absolutely critical. What is the place of human rights in the narrative of the country? Its history, where it is now, and how it can best effectively address the challenges it faces. So human rights has to be insinuated into the national discourse. This is part of the solution to the country's future. It's not a problem in terms of the country's future. Now, often in countries, I'll say, if you're quite hostile towards human rights per se, think about the SDGs. And if you want to have a discussion about the SDGs, let's have a discussion about that, knowing that implicitly that takes you towards the human rights agenda. And that applies in many countries that I operate in. Another might be a country may simply need to have an international standing and status to be recognized internationally. And having an NHRI can be quite a persuasive means of achieving that. There's a role for academics in engaging in this public discourse on the place of human rights historically today and tomorrow, and making sure it's seen as a positive feature. The second sort of dimension is very important, that even when things seem beyond any hope of making any progress today, cultivate political relationships across the political parties, within the current government, but across the National Assembly, across the Parliament. Because when the moment comes, you do need a key individual or key individuals to work with you to make this happen. And very often, as I said at the outset, it's relationships that count. And the work that the Minerva Centre has done and will continue to do, I think, is very, very helpful in that process. And the third is seizing the moment. A moment may arise without any anticipation. An issue may come up that simply grabs the public attention or international attention. It comes from virtually nowhere. And that's why you have to be prepared to say, here's a big issue that there's public concern and public support potentially for doing something about this in a serious, meaningful way. Part of that is to establish a national human rights institution and to work with the media when that moment arrives, because they will play a very critical role in giving support. So an NHRI can bring out the best of all these different actors and players, and it really is a prize worth preparing for and not just waiting for something to change in the future that might make it easier for us to do it. Very often progress is made in difficult conditions, and then being able to seize the moment when they change to some extent. So good luck.
Thank you for that inspirational ending, which will